to do is to share with all the friends here information about Cave Hill that I hope will enhance your experience of coming onto it. I mean, Cave Hill works simply as an outdoor space. It's a place that people can go and find consolation and rejuvenation in a way. But I think it works much better if you can relate to things in the landscape and think about, you know, the context of the hill itself. A couple of words about Cave Hill Country Park. Cave Hill Country Park goes back as far as 1992, which surprises quite a lot of people because they kind of think it's been there for maybe from the beginning of the 20th century. It wasn't. It has its origins. It was owned, of course, as you probably all know, by the Donegal family and then later the Shaftesbury family. But in 1934, the Shaftesbury family had basically lost interest in their Belfast holdings, and they gave some of the lands that they held, and they gave it to the council. They sold some of it where Waterloo Park and Innisfield Park and Strathmore is. They sold that to the council for housing, but they gave the rest to the corporation as it was. And to be fair to the council, you know, they're often criticised, but that was 1934 that happened. In the subsequent 60 or 70 years, the council, you know, pursued a policy of acquisition of land around the park. And in the 50s, for example, they bought the Audley estate, which is to the north of the castle. In the 80s, they bought Carr's Glen, I think it was in 86. And in 88, they bought the Wallace estate, which is the largest acquisition, it's about 300 acres. And that gave them a whole 750 acres. And they designated it a country park in 1992. And it is for the use of the citizens of Belfast and managed for them by the council. It is a wonderful, you know, those 750 acres encompass everything from down here, you can see there's parkland, and then you've got the forest, and then you've got a scarp, kind of an edge, and then out at the back, you've got moorland. So there's everything here. And it's because of its closeness to Belfast, and it's been featured largely, it features largely in the present, in the minds of the present day citizens of Belfast. Because on our Facebook page, we get, you know, lots of queries from abroad and people reminiscing about Cave Hill. It's very important to them, particularly the expats. It's also important to the people who live in Belfast, who always like to look up to Cave Hill. Not that many of them actually came to Cave Hill pre-COVID days, but they always like to look up to it, and it kind of encapsulated for them Belfast. And that particular view of Cave Hill goes back. It wasn't just a 20th century thing. I mean, it goes way, way back as far as it certainly goes back to the 18th century. But here's an example in the 19th century. A poet called Alice Milligan, who was she came from the local aristocracy, Church of Ireland, but was a nationalist, knew all the people involved in the nationalism around the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century. But she also wrote poetry. And she wrote this poem called Mountain Shapes, which has about 10 verses in it. And the first 9 verses extol the beauties of the various mountain ranges in Ireland. And then she finishes on the 9th verse, but, and this is the 10th one, look up from the streets of the city, look high beyond tower and mast. What hand of what Titan sculptor smote the crags on the mountain vast? Made when the world was fashioned, meant with the world to last. The glorious face of the sleeper that slumbers above Belfast. And if you get behind the kind of 19th century verbiage and floridity and the lack of scientific fact in it, there is still behind that, there is this clearly an identification with and a fondness for Cave Hill. And she mentions the glorious face of the sleeper. And here's the glorious face of the sleeper. This is the sleeping giant on Cave Hill. And you can see there, sometimes it depends on the way the angle of the sun. I think when I shot this one, I got the angle about right, because I think it's quite clear there that you've got an eye here, a nose, a mouth, and a chin here. You've got a forehead here, and you've got a cap. And that cap was actually known in the early 19th century, late 18th century, was known as the Cap of Liberty. Because the people in those days were very much taken with the French Revolution, and the revolutionaries in France wore this Cap of Liberty. So when I came to Belfast, more years than I care to count now, and I took an interest in Cave Hill, and I'd be talking about Cave Hill, and people would tell me about Cave Hill and tell me they were up on the nose, where they clearly meant they were here. And I was a prig. I said, no, you're entirely wrong. That's the nose is above the caves here. I would show them photographs and say, look. And that continued for an embarrassing number of years until I took this photograph one day. Now, I didn't deliberately set out to have that kind of hazy photograph. It was probably bad photography on my part. Or if you want to be charitable, blame the camera. But when I looked at that photograph and I suddenly saw the giant, there's another giant on Cave Hill. And if you look at that, you can clearly see there's a nose, which is McArt's fort. There's a mouth and a chin, and there's a forehead.
Yeah.
So there is another giant on Cave Hill. And if anybody calls McArt's fort the nose, who am I to quibble? The only quibble I might have is Napoleon had a snub nose. Wellington had more of a hook nose like that. So it really ought to be called, from that point of view, Wellington's nose. But of course, it's not going to be, and never ever would be. Oh yes, the other thing before I move on to that, the city council has promulgated, and other people have as well, that this was that Dean Swift took this as an exemplar, and he was inspired by it to create the figure of Gulliver. That is probably unlikely. It's a nice story, and if it works for the tourist board and works to promote Belfast, I'm nothing against it, but it's quite unlikely because, well, a number of reasons. Swift, there's nothing at all in Swift's papers at all anywhere indicating that he took any sort of cognizance of things around Belfast. He hated the place. He was a curate out in Kilroot, outside Carrickfergus. He hated it. He couldn't stand the place. He was only here for about 18 months. He was forever going up and down to Dublin. And of course, he would have come past on his way from Belfast to Carrickfergus. He would have seen Cave Hill. And this was in the late 1600s. And he wrote Gulliver's Travels in the 1725s, 24, 25, in and around that. In other words, over 25 years later. And I would think that 25 years later, he would not have sought inspiration from a place that he absolutely loathed and hated. But it's a nice story, and nobody will ever know, and it could be right. And I think we'll just have to leave it like that there. And if it's, as I said, if it brings people to Belfast, well and good. What I want to do, I mean, the title of the talk really, it starts with the geology and it goes on to the archaeology and the history and the environment. So I'm going to start with the foundations, the rock foundations of Cave Hill. And Cave Hill has, and the reason I'm doing this is because everything that I'm going to talk about tonight there's evidence for it on the hill. If you keep your eyes about you when you're on the hill, you will see these things. There are various types of rock lying around Cave Hill. Not, I hasten to add, on the main pass, which have been stoned by the council and they brought in simply aggregate from elsewhere. But when you're off the main pass and you find bits and pieces of rock, you will find samples of all these rocks in front of you here. The earliest rock that was laid down about 240, between that and 200 million years ago, is this bottom rock here. This one here, which is Triassic mudstone. It's slightly soapy when wet. It's a mud, it's like compressed mud. And then between 200 and 145 million years ago, in the Jurassic time, there was a different mudstone because the sea conditions were different and there was degrees of vegetation in the water. So the mud that was put down in the bottom of the sea was this green lias clay or Jurassic mudstone. And there are examples of that on Cave Hill, and I'll show you a bit in a minute. Between 145 million years ago and about 65 to 70 million years ago was a period called the Cretaceous. And in that, again, this part of the world was underwater, and you had tiny little microscopic creatures called monococcoliths living in the water with a tiny little calcium carbonate skeleton. And as they died in their uncounted quadrillions, and they formed this kind of ooze at the bottom. And then over a period of time, as the water receded and the land rose and the other rocks accumulated above it, it compressed it to give us our typical Cave Hill Irish limestone here. And in that limestone, you will also get examples of flint. Most of the flint is grey. This is a piece of red flint. Some of the red flint is actually very nice. And that probably, nobody knows for certain, it may be the remains of Cretaceous sponges. And then above that again, you have another layer where you find three very different rocks. Essentially, you've got basalt. And this rock with little white specks in it is basalt. And if basalt cools, and I'll talk a bit more about it in a minute, if it cools very slowly, it forms a much harder rock called dolerite. And in between different layers of basalt, you will get a red rock called laterite. And these are all visible in Cave Hill, though you will see better examples of them as you go up the Antrim coast, and particularly over in Rathlin Island. So just to give you an idea, here's the Triassic mudstone in Carr's Glen. So you can walk to this point and you can actually lift the mudstone and feel the soapiness of it. Because it's the first stone, it's at the lowest end, you will only find it at a low point, and you will find it in Carr's Glen. So you would expect then to find the lias clay above that. So you go up Carr's Glen a bit and you come to this, and you can see, I hope here, you can see little threads and veins of that lias clay. This must be very close to the boundary between the lower red mudstone and the top grey mudstone. If you wanted to see a large amount of it, go to Colin Glen. There are large exposures of the lias clay in Colin Glen. We don't have, to my knowledge, any exposures of it in Cave Hill. They may be further up the glen there, but the top end of Carr's Glen is heavily covered in shrubs and it's virtually impenetrable. But it should be there. And the evidence that it is there is there in those veins. Carr's Glen, and there's the Triassic mudstone in Carr's Glen. There are the veins that I talked about of the grey lias clay. They're at the top end of the red mudstone. And I just got about as far as this slide here, where the next layer above that, if you remember, was the limestone. And you can see the limestone here. Now it's covered in vegetation because this quarry stopped in the 1890s and it's had 120 years to regenerate, and nature's done a pretty good job. And it has covered all the rock exposures, which is good. And you can also see then on top of the limestone, you can see the basalt that overlies it here, that grey, browny rock. Now, the fact that the nature has covered that is in one way a pity, because here's a picture that was taken in the 1890s, more or less in the same place. It was in and around, as best I can make out, it was in this area here. And that picture shows, there's the limestone again, there's the basalt on top, but it shows this thing here called the volcanic dike. Because if you think about it, the three previous rocks were all sedimentary. They were laid down, each different rock was laid down on top of the one before it. The basalt came from underneath. Basalt was originally red hot magma. To get to the surface, it had to punch through. And about 65 to 55 million years ago, this part of the Earth's crust was subject to a lot of forces. The Atlantic was expanding and the crust was being pulled every which way, and occasionally weaknesses would occur and the pressure from underneath would drive up red hot magma, which would come up in a column and then spread out over the surface. And this is an example of a volcanic dike, evidence that actually was a process that happened. And I talked earlier about dolerite. The magma that solidifies here in that pipe is solidifying underground. It's heavily insulated by the ground. It cools very slowly and forms that hard rock dolerite. Whereas the magma that comes up to the surface and spreads out over the surface forms basalt. I have to say that it would probably form a layer maybe no more than 2 or 3 meters thick. And over maybe those 10 odd million years, there'd be uncounted layers, different eruptions that would occur. And this red hot magma would gloop out over the landscape and then would eventually cool. Vegetation would grow maybe for 1,000 years, maybe more, before the next eruption would occur somewhere. And the magma would come out over the landscape again, baking the vegetation and creating that laterite, that red rock rich in iron ore called laterite. And you will see that on Cave Hill. Now, if I just go on a bit to this, I talked about the layers of basalt, and you can see this. You can see clearly the layered nature of the fascia that has the caves in it. I'll talk about the caves in a minute, but just concentrate on the layering nature. Each one of the layers, because every eruption would occur maybe under slightly different climatic conditions, maybe even slightly different chemical compositions in the magma. So each layer is discernible here, and you can see the layer. There's a layer there. There's another one there. There's another one there, and you can see the various layers. And one thing, I had this photograph for a number of years before I really noticed something. If you concentrate on this layer here above the fifth cave, it's a slightly pinky color. And can you see there's a discontinuity here and here? It's different. Something is broken through there. And if you seeing that, you can then trace, there's a vertical column the whole way down here, and right down to here. Now that is a volcanic dike, which is still visible on Cave Hill. If you stand below the caves and look up to the caves, you will see that evidence of something that happened somewhere around about 60 million years ago. And that would have been one of the eruptions that would have been higher up on the hill, coming magma pushing up through all the previous ones. And while we've got the caves, let me talk about them. There are 5 caves. Now, the only one you can get into with a reasonable degree of safety is Cave 1. Cave 2, which is on this layer, on this ledge here, but in behind it, Cave 2 is accessible by climbing up here at the left-hand edge. It's not impossible. I'm not encouraging anybody to do so, but I mean, I've done it and it can be done. Cave 2 is here. Cave 1, Cave 2. Cave 1 is quite a large one. Oh, just about Cave 1 as well. There's quite a climb up to, it's about 14 or 15 feet from ground level, present day ground level, up to the cave, up this and the rock itself is not, basalt is not a good rock to climb on. You can getting up is easy, getting down is a bit more problematical, and it's a big cave to get into. But the largest cave is this one, Cave 3. This little hole here opens up into a cavity about 30 feet deep and maybe about 25 feet across. And the back of Cave 3 opens up. You can climb out the back of Cave 3 and up into the bottom, the floor of Cave 4, which is that. And Cave 5 is in the top right-hand corner of Cave 4. So those 3, 4, and 5 form a connected system. 2, which is in behind this ledge, is about 6 foot by 5 foot. It's not very big at all. And then the bottom cave. And those are the 5 caves. And what they were used for, well, we're never really going to know. The council I've seen something they've written, they were possibly iron mines. Well, I, for my sins, I've been in them all. I've climbed into the top 3 caves as well. I wouldn't recommend it. But having been in them, and also having been in an iron mine in Lyle's Hill in South Antrim, not very far away from Cave Hill, the iron mine is a rich red colour inside with the iron ore. I don't remember seeing any redness or any coloration like that in any of the caves on Cave Hill. So I doubt if they're iron mines. What they may have been was some sort of weakness in the rock. And probably people who lived on the shores of Belfast Lough, especially, you know, we're going back a couple of thousand years. Any ships coming into Belfast Lough would have been a threat, or would have been perceived as a threat, and you would have wanted somewhere safe to retire to. And I imagine that the caves could well have had that function, that people could have retired up into the caves because you were still pretty precarious to get at them. There was, until the 18th century, you could have climbed up a ledge up this gully and gone across into caves 3, 4, and 5. That's all gone. It's all crumbled away. But back in the day, if you were standing here with a sword in your hand and your wives and children behind you, no invader's going to come near you. They might steal your cattle and maybe burn your house, but they won't touch you because you'll be safe. And that it may have had that sort of function. I mentioned laterite. Now there's a rock of laterite on one of the paths above to the left of the caves, between the caves and McArt's Fort. That's sticking out of the ground. Up in Antrim, you'll see actual big layers of laterite, but laterite outcrops do occur on Cave Hill. Here's another remnant or a reminder of the layered nature of the landscape of Cave Hill. This is Collinward Hill, which is right behind Cave Hill. This was taken from Cave Hill itself. And you can see here the stepped nature of that profile. The stepped nature of that profile going down like this reflects the fact that the landscape underneath it was laid down in layers. And it's still there in the landscape to look at it. I had to be shown that by a geologist. I wouldn't have seen it otherwise. And one final thing about the basalt. The pipe that you saw at the caves and the pipe even in the quarry, they're too small to have covered the landscape. They would have just had little local eruptions. There had to be somewhere near Cave Hill, there had to be a large pipe, large diameter pipe, carrying the magma up in sufficient quantity to cover the landscape. And the nearest we know to Cave Hill was here. That quarry above Carnmoney Cemetery, which is here. And Sam Marks's farm is there. And there's the quarry. And it's not a coincidence that it's a quarry, because dolerite was a valuable stone because it was hard. You could build with it. And some of the buildings in Belfast and surroundings were built with dolerite, and some of it may have come from that very quarry. I mean, Carrickfergus Castle is built with dolerite. Crumlin Road Jail built with dolerite. The wall of the Clifton Street Cemetery opposite the gates of St. Malachy's at the bottom of the Antrim Road, that's dolerite. So dolerite was a useful building material, and a number of other buildings in and around Belfast built with it. Basalt is a lousy rock. The thing about basalt is it contains these wee white things. I've got an example of basalt here, and I don't know whether this is going to work, but I've got a piece of basalt. I'm going to try to break it. It crumbled a bit. I don't know whether you can see that or not. But basalt, that wee bit of basalt I had in my hand here, it's hard to know where the camera is. There's that wee bit of basalt, I just crumbled a bit off it. Basalt is a very soft, friable rock. And one of the reasons is because it contains this mineral here called zeolites. And I have to use the plural there because it's a family of minerals. And it's a very valuable commercial material. And in 1989, the government here gave permission to the Glenchest Mineral Company to prospect Cave Hill for zeolites. And the feeling that very quickly arose in North Belfast, particularly, look, if the government is given permission to prospect, there's no point doing that unless there's the expectation that they could get a license to mine it if it was there in quantity. So there was a furore and an uproar. Save the Cave Hill campaign was founded. I missed the inaugural meeting, but I joined a week or two later. And there was a row kicked up, and the proposal to survey Cave Hill died away. Now, whether as a result of our efforts, which we like to think, but probably more realistically, there weren't enough zeolites there. And then we were left, well, the Save the Cave Hill campaign, save it from what? What do we do now? So after a couple of years, we had a meeting and decided, well, we want to stay in business because we want to tell the authorities essentially that if they get up to any more shenanigans, we're ready to take them on. So we kept the word campaign, but we went then in the direction of conservation. So we called ourselves the Cave Hill Conservation Campaign. And we're still that to this day. And we have a strong conservation ethos. And we also have a strong educational ethos, which this walk talk is part of. But we also do a series of walks every year on Cave Hill, and I'll give you more information about that at the end of the talk. But the zeolites, when you'll see them, when you pick up a piece of basalt, you'll see these zeolites. And if it doesn't have the zeolites, if it's a hard rock that you can't break a bit off, it's probably dolerite. And that concludes the geology part of it, because there's nothing else to say about the geology. And we come then to times whenever humans left their mark on the landscape. Now, the first humans that we know of in Ulster appeared in and around 7,500 BC. There are remains at Mount Sandal outside Coleraine, because they were hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gatherers, by their very culture, live very light on the land. They don't leave any traces. They move around, they hunt and they gather, and they don't really form permanent communities. It's very hard to find any trace of them. They did, however, they did have skills in working flint, because people who lived in Ulster had access to flint, which in prehistoric times was very, very valuable material, because you could make instruments with it, implements. And the only thing I've found that could conceivably be Mesolithic. this is from 7,500 BC to about 4,000 BC, is this. Now, you may not be able to see it properly on that there, but that little thing there is a flint scraper. It's extremely thin, as you can see. It's very
Sorry,
thin.
we're not, sorry for interrupting.
Are we losing it again?
It's frozen again, yeah.
Oh dear. Okay, I'll stop the share and start again. Sorry about that. Where did I lose you? At this particular one here. This is, okay, I'll try sharing the screen again. Now, if I just click forward and back, is that move forward and back?
Yes, that's it now.
That's it, good. Okay, that might happen one or two more times. I do apologize, but I have sometimes, it's never happened before, mind you, in this, but anyway, we're talking about Mesolithic people, and this particular flint scraper, which I love to handle, because that clearly was deliberately made by somebody. It could have been 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. It might have been a wee bit earlier or later than that. But
sorry, we're still not seeing the scraper.
No, the scraper, I'm holding it up to my. Can you see me on screen?
Oh, we see you now. Yes.
I'm holding
my
up.
Apologies.
Okay. Keep me right. Please keep me right. Anytime anything happens. But that little wafer thin scraper was clearly made as an implement. I wouldn't give that away for all the tea in China. It's really glad to have found that, and I love to handle it and love to think humans 7,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, maybe handled that. But that was the only possible. It might be Mesolithic, it might be Neolithic. I don't really know, and I'm not skilled enough in flints to know. So the only time that you do find reliable marks on the landscape left by humans was in the Neolithic times, which starts about 4,000 BC in Ireland. And that was at a time when agriculture came in. And think about it, if you've got agriculture and you're cultivating, you need to stay. If you need to stay, you need to mark your territory and you need to defend it. So what you do is you put stone cairns on top of all the high grounds, and every single peak in the Belfast Hills has or had stone cairns on top of them. Because agriculture is a much more efficient way of producing food, not everybody has to hunt and gather as the previous people would have done. So it frees up people to develop other skills. For example, flint knapping. You might have had a priestly class. In fact, you probably would. You would have had a lordly class, people to give the orders and direct the people. People who give the orders to say, build me a cairn on top of that hill. And there would be enough leisure around, because not everybody had to spend all their time hunting for food. Be enough leisure around for people to go and build it. So every cairn, and Cave Hill is no exception. This is about 18 meters or 50 feet higher than McArd's Fort behind it, but it's only a 2-minute walk. When you're at McArd's Fort and you look westwards, you're looking over that cairn. And when you walk up to the cairn, as I hope you would do anyway, you find you have this gathering of stones in the middle. The cairn itself is about 14 meters across, and you have stones there that clearly have collapsed in on themselves. And that's the indication that there was a cavity there. And that's quite common, because the ruling class of that particular time, the habit was, the custom was that they were buried in these cairns that they had constructed. And what you did was you created a hollow within the cairn, and you put into that either the bones or the ashes. Bodies were either exposed to the elements to reduce them to bones, or else burned. And then the remains were placed in cavities in the cairns called kist burial. The whole thing is called a kist burial. That one we know of because the stones have collapsed. There may well be other ones there as well. It's never been excavated, and it probably never will be excavated, because it's not that uncommon in Ireland. So there's nothing particularly unusual about it, but it's unusual in that it's ours and it's on Cave Hill. And that's the only thing that I know of in Cave Hill that's Neolithic. Coming forward then to the end of the Neolithic period, which was about 1500 BC in Ireland. For the next 1,000 years, between 1500 and 500 BC, you would have had, it was called the Bronze Age, you would have had metalworking skills coming in, and working with bronze and working with gold as well. And McArd's Fort is, the archaeologists are never quite certain, there's not very much dating evidence on it. It's either late Bronze or possibly early Iron Age, which came after the Bronze Age, but I like to think of it as Bronze Age. The fort is a bit of a misnomer. Its technical term is a promontory fort. But a fort is not a defensible place in this particular case, because you couldn't defend that. If people were attacking you, it's flat. They can get quite close to you. They can just stand outside and throw rocks, or simply put a cordon around and wait for you to starve, because there's no resources inside it. There's no water. There's no places that you can house animals or whatever. It's not a defensible place. But it would have been a place that would have been very important to the people who live below it. Because if you're living down there among forests and woodland, then to celebrate the big occasions in your society, the deaths, rulers, the prominent births, solstices, disasters, whatever, there would have been gatherings, and that would have been a very good place to gather, because the views from Cave Hill, as I hope to finish, show you the views from Cave Hill. The views from Cave Hill are stunning, and you can see in first in 24 to 360 degrees right round. So that's probably what it was, a kind of a celebratory place rather than a military fort. This, again, in the Bronze Age, this was a gold dress fastener found in 1993 by people using a metal detector. Now, you're not allowed to do that anymore. And I think maybe this thing might have been the reason for it. But to be fair to the two people who found it, they did the right thing. They reported it to the authorities. The Ulster Museum came out and did a dig, and just to establish some sort of context for it. And they then presented it to the Ulster Museum. Well, presented it. They did get monetary compensation, as you're entitled to if you find these things. It's about, it's kind of, if I hold that up to my face, it's about, what, 4 or 5 inches across? No, it wouldn't be. It's about 3 inches across. It's 93 odd grams of gold. Quite a valuable object. When it was found, Richard Warner of the Ulster Museum called it a dress fastener, which I like, because it would function as a dress fastener. You think of a heavy woolen cloak over your shoulders with 2 eyelets in it, and this thing threaded through the eyelets just to hold the cloak in position. It works. It's described in the Ulster Museum at present in the display case as a 3/4 bell-ended bracelet. And I don't think that works as well. I think you're wearing one of those on your wrist, it's going to be very clunky, and it's going to be awkward. So I think it works better as a dress fastener. But archaeologists are cautious creatures nowadays, and they prefer to describe rather than ascribe. So they describe it as a 3/4 bell-ended bracelet. But that was also dated to the Bronze Age. And then we hop forward past the Iron Age, because there's nothing, unless McArt's Fort is an early Iron Age object or place, there's nothing to reflect the Iron Age, when metal working skills moved from bronze into harder materials like iron. And we come to right forward to the Christian time. This is about 7th century, the early Christian period. And where we are is Hightown Road. Those of you who know Cave Hill might recognize the Hightown Road comes up over here. In fact, I think there's just maybe a possibly car there between the hedge. Past out here, the Hightown Road car park is just to the right of that picture. And at the back end of the eastern end of the Hightown Road car park, there's a stile. You step over the stile and you're in this field, and you walk up the stile's down here, and you walk up to this area here, and you can see this cashel. It's called a cashel because that's an archaeological term for an early Christian settlement, or Christian farmhouse, really. And what it probably was, it was fortified. This wall would have been much higher. Let's think about it in the 7th century. The Celts, the Celtic tradition of cattle rustling, cattle raiding, was still probably alive at the time. So your cattle were always in danger of getting stolen, and there were wolves around. So at night particularly, you'd want to have somewhere safe to bring them in. So they constructed this 48 meters stockade, and in it they would have had a dwelling. If you visit there, you will find no trace of that dwelling. There is here, just in this, the western end of it, there's a rectangular remains. But the Belfast Hills Partnership funded a dig there a number of years ago, just to try and get some sort of context for it. And it was discovered it was about probably 18th century, certainly not 7th century or 8th century. So that was probably people using maybe material around from the cashel and using it to construct some sort of dwelling a couple of hundred years ago. Now, the other thing is, there were troubled times, and you might be able to defend your stock against wolves or the occasional solitary raider, but if an armed bunch of men approached you, you would have had a hidey hole. We talked in the caves in terms of a hidey hole. There were troubled times. People needed hidey holes. And very often you get hidey holes associated with 7th century or with early Christian farmhouses, like our farm settlements like this. Now, there wasn't any that I knew of on Cave Hill. There were a couple of them on Carn Moneylight, and they're very, very common throughout. They're called souterrains, as in the souterrain, they under the ground. The technical term the archaeologists use is souterrains. But I didn't know of any on Cave Hill until I got a phone call, oh, must have been 7 or 8 years ago, from a chap who said, I want to show you something on Cave Hill. So it's a prehistoric thing. And he described where it was. And I said, nope, there isn't. Being the prig again. No, definitely not. He said there is. I said there isn't. He said, well, look, I'll tell you, I'll take you there. So he took me there. And he took me past this here, through that field. If any of you have been in that field and know, you can get through that field and you emerge into Ballyahagan. Now I lost the, can I change this? Yes, there we go. Into this field system. Now, that field system is a lovely place to visit. Not that many people do. You go from the car park and they follow the main track up onto Cave Hill. If you go into that field system, Ballyahagan Nature Reserve, it's a lovely place to be. Plenty of wildflowers, lovely rich place to be. Nice feeling about it. But he brought me to this field boundary here. Could see nothing particularly there. And then he brought me closer. Something maybe there. Then he brought me closer still. And I could see there was definitely something here. And then when I stuck a camera there where that little arrow is, that's what I saw. And that's clearly the remains of a souterrain. Now, the remains, it would have extended beyond that again. But that would have been a hidey hole. It would have been a tunnel into which there would have been 2 entrances quite far apart. And that's a place that, in the event of a large raid coming, you could hide your most valuable pieces of property and probably your family as well, and hide in there and hopefully never be found again and survive the experience. So that's a souterrain on Cave Hill. Probably, it's hard to, we can never know for certain, probably associate with that castle that we saw a while ago there. Now, this is Belfast Castle, which brings us straight from the 7th century to the early 17th century. And there's a lot I could say about the Donegal family, and they're fascinating. They shaped Belfast. Belfast would not be what it is without the Donegal family. At one stage owned all of Belfast and lots of other land. They had land in County Donegal. That's where they got their name, even though they misspelled it. The Donegal family have 2 L's. Donegal County has 1 L. But they're not that relevant to Cave Hill, other than the fact that they owned it. It's worth another lecture on its own right on the Donegal family. I'll very quickly go through a few things, but this will be a very quick cook's tour. That castle itself doesn't go back that far. That castle was built in the 1860s. It was finished by 1870. In it, there are pictures, and some of the pictures I'm going to show you are in the castle. And I would urge you, when you're up there, walk into the castle and have a look at some of the pictures. And there's a couple of pictures in particular I'd like you to look at. This is Sir Arthur Chichester, essentially the first Chichester who became Lord Deputy of Ireland, wielded a lot of power. He was the one who got all the land. There is the 5th Earl. Now we're down into the 18th century. By that stage, the Donegal family, you need to know this, the Donegal family were one of the richest families in the whole of these islands. They had an income in modern terms of something close to £50 million a year. It's a lot of money. They had large land holdings in Fisherwick in Shropshire. They had a large house in the most fashionable part of London. This picture of the 5th Earl was painted by Gainsborough. Gainsborough didn't come cheap. He was the leading portrait artist of his day. He was very expensive. They lived high on the hog. So they had this guy here, the 5th Earl, he was so rich and actually handled his estates in Belfast so well. He never went there, but he took a great interest in Belfast, and he was the one who shaped Belfast and made them build wide streets and wonderfully large buildings. And that Georgian feel of parts of Belfast around the city hall are due to him, because he had the people in Belfast were paying him rent, and he had them on short leases. So if they stepped out of line, he had the power to withdraw the leases. So they did what they had to do. His one besetting sin, his pictures in the castle, not the original Gainsborough, a picture of the Gainsborough. This is the original. This is a picture of the original, which is in Belfast Castle. This is the bane of Arthur, the first Marquis, his life. This is his son, George Augustus Chichester. I could say a lot about him. I won't now, but some other occasion I might. All I'll say about George Augustus Chichester is he died in 1844. He was born in 1767, I think it was. He took over. Well, even before he took over, he was a spendthrift. He was a rakehell. He was an absolute. He was known as the Marquis of Donegal. He's supposed to be the Marquis of Donegal, and he was known as the Marquis of Donegal because he did them all. He did all the money lenders and cheated and lied and then swindled his way around. And eventually, London got too hot for him, and he had to come back to Belfast. And that was when the Chichesters came back to Belfast. When he died in 1844, the estate, which had been generating round about £50 million a year, was on the verge of bankruptcy. They had nothing left. All their land had gone, had been sold. The only thing, when George Augustus Chichester died, the only thing they had left was land on Cave Hill, which was the deer park. They had a piece of land where Ormo Park is now, where they had a house. And they also had some land up out around Doak. And they also, I think, kept the mineral rights to Loch Nain, maybe one or two other little parcels of stuff. Essentially, they were broke. And he was the one who broke them. And what they had to do then was they had to come up with swizz to try and get money into the family. He tried it. And there's a lovely story, which I will keep for another occasion, as to how he failed to marry his son into the Shaftesburys. But his son, well, before I tell that story, this is when they came to Ireland, they lived here on a house. You might recognize that because that's taken from where the modern City Hall is, was painted or sketched from the modern City Hall. That's Donegal Place to the right. And this is Donegal Square North. Then that's another view of the house they had in Donegal Square. There's the house they had in Ormo. There's the picture of the second Marquis, a photograph. 1843 was the year before he died. And that was, must be one of the earliest photographs in Ireland. So he still had style. The man was flat broke, but he had style. There's George Hamilton Chichester, the third, his son, who inherited in 1844 and discovered to his horror that he was absolutely flat broke and everything had to be sold to cover the debts of the estate. He had one son, Frederick, who died in Europe, and he had a daughter. Oh, Frederick was then, when they built the castle, they built the Chapel of the Resurrection as a mortuary chapel, and Frederick's remains were there, along with some of the later Donegals as well, were put into the chapel. And again, there's a sad history there that's worth telling at some stage. Harriet Chichester was his only daughter, and she was the one who married into the Shaftesburys. And she married the son of the 6th Earl of Shaftesbury. And of course, being a woman, she couldn't bring her titles with her, or her father's titles. She couldn't inherit the father's titles. So the Donegal name then went elsewhere. It actually went to the Dean of Raphoe up in County Donegal, who was a cousin of that the previous Chichester. And Harriet married into the Shaftesburys, and she brought with her, what she could bring with her was her properties, what was left of them, the castle estate. At that stage, I think that, yes, Ormo Park was still part of it as well. And the odd little bit and piece, whatever was left, she brought to the Shaftesburys. But essentially, they became Shaftesbury property. Because as a woman, when she married in, her property became their property. And this was in the 1860s, 70s. When Harriet died, during the time that Harriet was alive, the Shaftesbury family took some interest in their Donegal, in their Belfast estates. And they would have, well, actually, I failed to mention that the money that was generated or made available as Shaftesbury money was what built Belfast Castle. Because the Donegals did not have enough money to build the castle. It was Shaftesbury money that built the castle. And when Harriet then died, having lived sporadically in the castle. The Shaftesburys over the next number of years took less and less interest in matters in Belfast. So by the time it came to 1934, they really had lost all interest in it, and they were glad, I think, to get rid of it. And they gave it to the city council, having sold the most valuable part for housing, as I mentioned at the start. That was Harriet's son. He was the 9th, but he's now the 9th Earl of Shaftesbury. The Donegal title is gone. There's the gate lodge, originally up to the castle. You can see there, you can see the castle in the distance here. You can see the Chapel of the Resurrection ahead of it. And this gate lodge is still on the Antrim Road. But there's one of the gate posts up into the estate. And that gate post has been shifted to the top of Innisfield Park, where the two gate posts then greet you as you're coming into the modern estate. And the wolves on top of those pillars are the supporters of the Donegal family arms. And just there's the Donegal family arms. You can see the two wolves, stylized wolves, and in vitam sequitur honor, which for the Latinists amongst you, you'll recognize as being that honors accrue to those who don't seek it. Well, given George Augustus's history, that's a bit ironical. Now, there's various other historical things that are well worth mentioning and in the park. And the Volunteers' Well, I would draw your attention to. It's to the north of the castle. I actually was walking past it today. It's called the Volunteers' Well because it was used by the Irish Volunteers, who were a militia set up in the 18th century, in the 1780s. The English were involved on the continent and involved in America in armed conflicts, and there was no standing army available to guard the coast, and they were scared of maybe invasion from either France or America. So they encouraged the citizens of Belfast to set up a militia, which suited them fine because, you know, the citizens were paying for it themselves. And of course, they were the middle class citizens, the great and the good of Belfast contributed to this. And they used to meet and drill in this area of the estate. Now, the thing about that is that the minute that's all woods, but back in the day, back in the 18th century, the Cave Hill was largely open. Most of the trees on Cave Hill were built were planted at the time when the castle was built in the 1860s. So this would have been a good area for maneuvers because you had a good source of water in the middle of it. And the thing about the Volunteers then was the government then quickly realized, hang on, get a second, guys, we've created an armed force in our midst. And you know those Irish over there, I mean, they can get a bit antsy and a bit insurrectionist, where we better do something about it. So they disbanded the Volunteers. And to some extent they were right, maybe, because within the Volunteers, a lot of the Volunteers fell back into middle-class obscurity. Some of them joined the yeomanry, but some of the more radical members of the Volunteers, of the Irish Volunteers, became United Irishmen and were out in 1798. Beside the Volunteers' Well is this construction here. And I'll show you another picture of it. That's it there. And that's the cylinder. It looks like it might have been a well. And there is a book written about the trees of Ireland, and it talks about the woods of Cave Hill. And isn't it an awful pity that the Volunteers' Well's all choked up? That well was built in the 1970s. And some of them were, the older ones amongst you will remember Enterprise Ulster, which was a scheme set up by the government to give employment experience to youngsters who hadn't yet entered employment. And they went and they did little construction things all over the place. And one of the things they did was they built this. And a lot of people think that that's the Volunteers' Well. Do visit the Volunteers' Well, but the well itself is the spring, not that construction that's beside it. So another interesting thing that you can, when the Volunteers' Well is actually shown here. This is the Antrim Road. This is a Donegal estate map, probably from the late 19th century. And there was a route up, a traditional route up from the Antrim Road right out to people going to Crumlin, Glenavy, South Antrim from Belfast, from the northern side of Belfast, would have gone out and gone up over Cave Hill as well. And not only that, but up beside the caves, where we had the pictures earlier, you had this large hollow known as the Devil's Punch Bowl. And in and around, that was the focus of the Easter Fair, which was held for hundreds of years. And it's been estimated there might have been up to 20,000 people up there on Easter Monday. And the route up to it lay up from the Antrim Road and straight up here, right up past the Volunteers' Well and on up the mountain. But this part of the land here, the Donegals, remember, all their property had been sold off. So this belonged to a family called Nash. And there's a chap called Joseph McGill who married into the Nashes had no sons, had 2 daughters. He married the elder daughter and inherited the land and decided to build himself a big house as befit the status that he imagined himself to have. And he built a house and he called it Martlet Towers. And you can see where he built it right on the line of the route up onto the hill. And he blocked the right of way. And there was a famous court case in 1859 when the Great and Good of Belfast took McGill to court, and they succeeded in reinstating the path up onto the hill. But the court, in its mercy, allowed McGill not to have the hoi polloi passing right by his house. They allowed him to create a path around it like this. And the road, if you drive into the estate from that shop that used to be on the Antrim Road there, it's now the back surgery of some form or clinic. The road goes up behind this row of cottages and swings around and then heads out past the Rose Garden, which is now the maze, and across to past the castle stables, which is now the children's playground, and up to the castle. So when you're driving up that road there, that was a road that McGill had to put in, or a path that he had to put in to, because the court made him do. But he was quite a nasty, obviously must have been a nasty guy, because he made part of the path narrow and he enclosed it between balks of timber on either side, and he painted the timber with creosote. And we're talking 19th century, men in their great coats, women in their voluminous frocks. So there's lots of complaints about people being covered in creosote. But he was doing what the court insisted that he did. He built the path. But he got his comeuppance in the end, because in the late 1860s, he was made bankrupt. And the land eventually had to get sold. And it was bought back by the Donegals, because at that stage they had the input of Shaftesbury money and they were able to buy that back. So this then became part of the castle estate. But yes, Joseph McGill would have been an interesting character. There's a picture of his house. His house survived until the 1970s. It was burned the remains of it was burned in the 1970s. This was probably taken in the 1950s. You can see the house is boarded up. In the early part of the 20th century, it was used, I think, as servants' quarters for the estate, because the estate was still being maintained, even though the Shaftesbury was no longer taking an interest in it, up to 1934. So it was in the early part of the 20th century that would have been used in the late part of the 19th century. This is all I can find. The area where Martlet Towers was is now, and you can see if I go back, you can see roughly where Martlet Towers was, because if you go up that road, driving up that road, and where you get, this is roughly where you turn and go past. There's the track there going past the maze. So you go up as far as that. There's the route that walks if you're walking up to the Volunteers Well. So you take left at that point, and you've actually passed by in the trees on your left. You've passed by Martlet Towers. It's a nice area to walk in. And there's loads of garlic and bluebells and stuff in there. So it's a nice area to go into. But that's where Martlet Towers was. And that's all that I can find of it. There's a couple of steps here buried in the undergrowth. I'm not going to say very much about the Griffith valuation. Throws light on the big quarry, the big Wallace quarry above Carr's Glen, which operated from the 1830s to about the 1890s. Griffith valuation was an Ireland-wide valuation of every piece of property and every bit of land. And in Antrim, it was done around about the 1860s. And it shows a row of cottages here, A to G. So there were 7 cottages there. And then it shows another row of cottages here, B to G. So there's 6 cottages there. And then there was a single house down here. And these were the workers who worked in the quarry. The actual route up from Carsden, if you walk it today, because this route here is the Green Road, the one that goes up to the Hightown Road up here. Goes out to the Hightown Road out here. And that's coming up from Carr's Glen, that's the route you would take there. And there's the T-junction at the top of Carr's Glen. And you can see up here on the right-hand side, that small row of cottages known as Mammystown. Nothing left of it at all. But when you go slightly higher up, and the path swings around in a curve to the right, and that's where Daddystown was. And that's where it is. There's the path swinging around here. And in there, you can actually step into the cottages and you can see just how small the cottages were. Labourers' cottages in the mid-19th century were pretty small affairs. It's shocking when you really see the small amount of space that people had to live in. But you can do that by going to Daddystown. And I'm going to finish, if I have another 5 minutes, Lizzie, if that's okay. I'm going to finish just by a quick survey of some of the other things you can look out for.
Perfect. Thanks, Cormac.
These are photographs taken by me. And I show that photograph to people, they say, no, there's none of those on KFL. What is it? And I say, it's a viviparous lizard, a common lizard, the viviparous lizard, and it does exist on KFL. And there's proof. That photograph was taken by me on the 14th of May, 2013. Butterflies, I survey butterflies in KFL. I love them. I think they're gorgeous. And that's some of the nicest ones. That's a thing called the dark green fritillary, one of the larger butterflies. There's a tiny little small copper. It's about an inch across. Lovely little, beautiful yellowish ochre color. And my favorite one, the common blue butterfly. Absolutely gorgeous. There are 18 species of butterfly on KFL, and you will see a lot of them if you walk on KFL. And you will even see this one. It's not a great photograph, but that butterfly, that is the cryptic wood white, which only exists in Ireland. Doesn't exist anywhere else. It is unique to Ireland, and we have it on KFL. There is a flower which in Ireland is unique to KFL. Sorry, it's unique to Ireland, and it exists on KFL. It's called the Town Hall Clock. It's the Adoxa, the muscatel. And it's called the Town Hall Clock because the flower exists on a stem. You can see the stem here. And on the top of the stem, there are kind of 4 faces in different directions, just like a Town Hall Clock. It's very hard to find. Since I took that photograph and realized it wasn't a great photograph, I'd love to go back, and I haven't been able to get back to it. It's really very, very hard to find and very impenetrable there. But it does exist. It makes KFL unique in having a particular flower. Scarlet elf cup. Wonderfully luscious, big, scarlet fungus. I saw some today. They're quite common on KFL. Keep your eye out for them. It's lovely when you see them. People commonly see them and their eyes open up and they bend down and they look at it. They love it. And the horrible name, yellow brain fungus, but a gorgeous fungus, very vibrant yellow fungus. Things to look at, KFL. Of course, bluebells and ramsons, which is wild garlic. Loads of it. I'm afraid though some people go up there and harvest it. I don't mind people harvesting a few leaves at a time. That's okay. I've done that myself. But people come up and with baskets and they just fill them. I suspect some of them are connected to the culinary trade. But who am I to say that? There's a raven's nest up on the cliffs above the main path past the caves. It's been there for hundreds of years. A perfect place for ravens, and you'll see ravens flying around it. I've kept this photograph here, and Ching might recognize this one. This is a gold crest, but I don't keep the photograph in for the gold crest. It's the smallest bird in Ireland, and it is actually on one of our walks that we do, which is where we look at birds and ring birds, and well, we've got a licensed ringer to do it, and we observe what he does. I keep that in because you see the expression on that young man's face. That encapsulates what you want to get in a youngster when you're showing them. I mean, as an ex-teacher, I rarely saw that degree of enthrallment, but the nature can do that far easier than a physics lab, and that's that. I think it's a wonderful expression. There's a bullfinch, see them occasionally on KFL, and I'm just going to finish with a quick tour of what you can see from KFL. Looking west, you've got the sperrins in the distance there, snow-covered sperrins. I love this photograph here. Looking kind of northwest, you'll recognize the very distinct profile of Slemish. That photograph hasn't been doctored. Newton Abbey has disappeared. And that light was exactly the light on the day. And I took that photograph quite a lot of years ago now. But I really do like that photograph. Then looking kind of north, that's not Slemish. That's Paddy's Milestone. That's Ailsa Craig, taken from KFL. That's the big granite rock outside Ayr. Then looking across, there's Kilroot Power Station. There's the Galloway Hills in the distance, quite visible. Then looking across Bangor, you're looking at the foothills of the Lake District. Looking across Scrabo here, that's the Isle of Man in the distance. Then looking down to the Mournes, and because the visibility is so good there, you don't really realize it, but the Dramara Hills, which lie outside Ballynahinch and lie between us and the Mournes, they're then in that picture as well. And then looking down to Gullion. So that's the whole panorama, 360-degree panorama from Cave Hill. It makes it what it is. I'm going to just very quickly go through that slot, and I was going to leave you with this particular slide here, which is our walks. We do a series of walks every year, and we get somebody who really knows. I'm a generalist. I know a little about a lot, but for walks like this, you need people who know a lot about a little. You want the specialists who will come and really entertain you. And we've been doing it for a number of years, very successfully. And this is this year's program. We had a program last year. We succeeded in, there was a slight easing of restrictions in July. We managed to get 2 of the walks in then. Other than that, everything was shut down. This is the program for this year. I'm hoping that April will go. I'm reasonably confident that we can probably get going in May anyway. So it's on our website. It's on our Facebook page. Have a look at it. They're free. Just simply turn up and take part. The details are there. And I hope the next time you do walk on Cave Hill that this talk tonight has in fact given you a little bit more perspective on things that you might see. And at that, I rest my case, other than for answering any questions that people might have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cormac. That was great. We do have a number of questions in for you, so here we go.
Okay.
So
if I can.
If you can, keep you on your toes. So we're starting back from the geology side of things. I've got a question in about what are zeolites used for that makes them valuable? Okay,
they're used mainly in the oil industry because if you've got two chemicals that you want to react together, if they're unwilling to, if they're unreactive to each other, you need to put them into a matrix where they're forced into very, very intimate connection. And zeolites under a microscope are like an open network with plenty of spaces in between. So when you flood your 2 chemicals into a base of zeolites, they act catalytically. They are catalysts, and they promote the reaction between the 2. And the oil industry is all about cracking and creating other compounds from existing compounds. So they're very concerned about that. The oil industry values zeolites particularly.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so when you were talking about the golden brooch, the little question popped up and said, is it gold actually to be mined locally in the hills?
Not that we know of. The nearest gold, I think, to here would be probably the Sperrins, or there might be some down in South Armagh. I've heard rumours, but the Sperrins would be probably the nearest sort of reasonable quantity of gold. I would imagine gold ornaments would have been carried around a lot at the time. They would have been valued, they would have been traded. So just because a gold ornament is found in Belfast doesn't mean to say there must have been gold in the area. It was probably traded in.
Okay, fantastic. There was a wee question about the book about the Cave Hill trees, but see someone else has kindly answered it and said that it was If the Trees Could Talk by Ben Simon book.
Yes.
And I'm just scrolling through here. A lot of just thank you very much, Cormac, from everyone coming through now at this stage. So I think that's maybe us in terms of questions.
Oh, that's fine.
So you got off lightly. I think you must have explained everything wonderfully. So thank you so much. Yep, a few last things clicked in here. Yep, just lots of thank you. So Cormac, thank you so much for tonight. It's been absolutely brilliant. And there will be a wee recording of this in the next day or so. Go onto our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to catch up with it then again.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much for listening to me.
Okay, night, folks.
Night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
I hope we see you later.
Bye.
Yes, William.